So while she's getting that going, I'll just keep talking to
And I'd
say
say
that,
just do it verbally. We keep having tech problems. Sorry, Medea.
okay, no problem at all. A few key things that I think are important when we are talking about this issue is, one, to say that the invasion by Russia is totally unjustified, that it is against international law, the UN Charter, the Kellogg-Briand Act. It's immoral, it's brutal, and we have to clearly show how much we are heartbroken about this war and what it's doing to the Ukrainian people. We have no idea of the numbers of civilians who've been killed, but we know it's in the thousands. And of course, the soldiers who are in many cases have to fight either because they want to resist the Russian invasion or because they're part of the Russian military. But so many thousands of them are being killed. And it's something that we clearly must condemn. We also must not fall in the trap of saying this is unprovoked, because it was clearly provoked by US and NATO actions over the years. And this is something we go into great detail in this book. And we also, oh, it's blurred, and in the video, to show how the expansion of NATO was indeed tremendously provocative and went against the promises that were made to Russia at the time. We talk about the 2014 uprising that started as a peaceful uprising, turned violent, and how the US got so involved in it that the US picked who would be the next leader of Ukraine. It is quite ironic with all the talk that we heard during the election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump about Russian interference. And here we have US direct interference in literally deciding who would be the head of Ukraine. And then we have the US after 2014, the arming of the Ukrainians, the training of 10,000 Ukrainian troops a year, the beefing up of US and NATO bases all around Russia, the military exercises that are extremely provocative, including a recent nuclear military exercise in which they are simulating the nuclear annihilation of Russia. So, and then I also want to add in something that we go into great detail in, which is what happened to the Minsk II agreements of 2015 and why weren't they implemented. And a lot of that blame goes not only to Ukraine, but also to the Western powers that were supposed to help implement that and didn't push for it. And when I say blaming Ukraine, there we have to say that every time that a leader of Ukraine wanted to implement those accords, the political part of the accords, which meant talking to the leaders of the breakaway republics in Donbass, they were threatened by the extreme right in Ukraine. That goes for Zelensky himself, who ran as a peace president, that he was going to end the civil war in the Donbass, and yet he was so viciously attacked by the extreme right that they threatened to hang him from a tree if he dared to do that. So I want to focus on how do we push a solution to this crisis. And there I want to look at the positions of Russia, Ukraine, the West, and the US, starting with Russia. Russia, obviously, tremendous miscalculation in terms of this invasion. Who knows what kind of terrible intelligence Putin was given if he thought he could indeed send his troops in to Kyiv and be welcomed as liberators and install a new government that was favorable to Russia. Obviously, that didn't happen. And Russians are losing badly on the battlefield, including right now, when they have evacuated the important capital of Kherson. They also are incurring more opposition at home. We saw hundreds of thousands of people leaving since the time the war began, and especially when they announced that they were going to bring up 300,000 more reservists to fight in this war. And Code Pink, my organization, and others have been working very closely with war resistors in Russia, which is very important to support them. The sanctions against Russia that were supposed to be an immediate bite into their economy have been slower because the price of oil and natural gas have skyrocketed. So even if Russia was selling less, they were getting more money. And the sanctions are indeed going to start hurting Russia more when they're not getting needed spare parts for some of their manufacturing, including the manufacturing of weapons. So Putin has staked his reputation on this war, but I think that there is almost a desperation on the part of the Russians to go into peace talks. Then we come to Ukraine. I mentioned that Zelensky himself was supposed to come in as a peacemaker, couldn't do that. And yet when talks were going on after the war began, mediated by Turkey, Zelensky was quite conciliatory. He said that Ukraine, it looked like they would not be able to be part of NATO, that they had to be a neutral country, and they were even talking about territorial concessions such as Crimea. The president then, well, the prime minister of the UK, Boris Johnson, as well as the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin from the US, went and met with Zelensky and basically told him, you can win this war. We will keep supporting you. This is not a time for talks. This is a time to go for victory. And so those talks were cut off, and the line of Zelensky has changed quite dramatically, calling for a fast track into NATO, but also saying they want to get back every inch of territory that Russia has taken, including all of Donbass and Crimea, which the US military people will tell you it's just irrational, that that is not a winnable position. In fact, you have the US Secretary, the US head of the Joint Chief of Staffs, Mark Milley, who recently said this war will not be won on the battlefield. And he himself has pushed for Ukraine to seize the moment of the wintertime and start negotiations. There is a lot of division within Europe. Some European countries are being so hard hit by these sanctions, especially Germany, that has been so dependent on Russian energy and is now totally affecting the entire manufacturing center. The inflation in Europe is tremendous. The price of energy is soaring. The price of foodstuffs is soaring as well. And this is, the right wing is taking advantage of this, organizing protests, and we see the right coming into power on the basis of the inflation in Europe in countries such as Italy and Sweden. So let's go to the US. The US says right now, the Biden administration, it's not up to us, it's up to the Ukrainians. Of course, if the US turned off the spigot, there would be a immediate need for the Ukrainians to talk. And we know how important the US role is, not only in keeping the weapons flow, but economically for Ukraine. They wouldn't be able to continue without that. So the US has a tremendous role to play. Unfortunately, Biden has been saying no talks. In fact, when it was brought up at the upcoming meetings of the G counterpart, Sergei Lavrov in Russia. The what has happened to the Democratic Party during this time is really a terrible shame, because we should have people in the Democratic Party who are standing up to call for peace. And yet when we saw those 30 members of the Progressive Caucus who put out a letter saying that there should be negotiations, it was shot down immediately. And let's also remember when the $40 billion was allocated for Ukraine, half of it for weapons, there was not one Democrat, not even Barbara Lee, who gave that prophetic vote against war back in 2001. No member of the squad, not one Democrat protesting. Yet there were 57 Republicans in the House and 11 senators who voted against that. We have to reflect how it is the either the Republicans or the extreme right Republicans who are taking advantage politically of this issue. We see Donald Trump coming out and saying this war could lead to a nuclear war or World War III. We better sit down at the table. If I were president, I would be negotiating. We see Fox News, Tucker Carlson reaching millions of people saying that the Democrats are giving away tens of billions of dollars. And in fact, there is another call for another $50 billion in this lame duck session. We have seen how the space for the call for peace has been taken up by some of the most extreme right-wing people in the Congress, such as a guy named Paul Gosar, who is one of the, who had been stripped of all his committees because he had videos online where he was killing AOC and fighting a sword fight with Biden. He has invited Zelensky and Putin to his district peace talks. I mean, this is ridiculous. We should be having the progressive members of the caucus not shot down when they call for negotiations, but lifted up. And this leads me to the issue that the 30 members of Congress were confronted with, which is they were told, you cannot talk to Putin. You cannot negotiate with this madman. And I want to spend just some time talking about that, because there were talks that were going on in April and May, in March and April that got shot down. In addition to that, there have been talks on a number of different issues between Russia and Ukraine. Smaller issues, but very important issues. One of them being the issue of grain. I mean, who knew before this war started that so much of the world, especially in Africa and the Middle East, was dependent on Ukrainian grain? And so the international community came in and helped negotiate a deal where they would open up corridors for the grain to be transported both by land and then by sea. That deal is supposed to expire in November 19th. Hopefully it will be renewed, but it shows how the international community was successful in negotiating that deal. There was also a deal that was reached when it looked like the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, the largest nuclear plant in Europe, was about to be blown up. And the international community worked with Ukraine and Russia to get the International Atomic Energy Association into that plant and calm things down. There have also been a number of prisoner swaps, which are not talked about in the US, but you can imagine, I think there's been about 18 of them already in just 9 months of fighting. You can imagine the difficulty that there is in negotiating what prisoners will be released, for which prisoners, what kind of logistics have to be agreed upon, the trust that has to be gained to make those prisoner swaps work. So those have been going on. And then between the US and Russia, there have been some talks, and those talks have been by the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, as well as the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, because they know how this could lead to a nuclear confrontation, a world war. And so they have been trying to contain this, this conflict. That means let the war keep going on, because the US does want to weaken Russia, but stop it from going into an all-out nuclear confrontation. I don't know about you, but I don't have a lot of confidence in those talks. I'm glad they're happening, but I still think there is way too much of a possibility of a nuclear confrontation coming out of this conflict. And so I think that leads us to the issue of what we can do. And here we have to say that we are not doing our job as peacemakers and putting enough pressure on the members of Congress, especially the more progressive members of Congress, the entire Democratic grouping in Congress, to come out for a ceasefire and negotiations. We have to do more. One area where I think we can do a lot more is education, because people are so confused about this issue. Reverend Moore, you talked about buying the book. I hope others will, and share it with your friends and relatives, especially those who don't think we should call for a ceasefire and negotiations. It's a good holiday gift. Watch the video. You can join a coalition called peaceinukraine.org. We also think it's important for the religious community to get involved in this issue. And I want to read a one-sentence statement that we just came up with today with the Fellowship of Reconciliation that is going to take this on. And our goal is to get 100 faith-based leaders. And Reverend Moore, I hope we can count you as one of those, to sign on to this statement and then take it to the religious liaison at the White House and ask for a meeting. It says, as people of faith and conscience, believing in the sanctity of all life on this planet, we urge our government to take a leadership role in bringing the conflict in Ukraine to an end through calling for a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement before the conflict results in a nuclear war that could devastate the world's ecosystems and annihilate all of God's creation. Finally, I want to say that sometimes we feel that we are a very small group when we hear the media and how much it is pushing for more weapons, let this war keep going, acting as if this is a winnable war. UN in September, when 66 nations got up and said, we must find a way to end this war. This is not about taking sides. There's only one side, and that is the side of peace. And we see it now at the COP27 meetings that are going on to try to find a way to ensure that we will have a planet in future generations. Crisis of the environment. And there was a head of a small island nation who said, my country is at risk of going underwater, and yet we have the rich countries of this world who have promised a global climate fund of $100 billion every year, not come up with it. We are calling for a fund for loss and damages. Look at Pakistan, that a third of the country was underwater. And yet the West has already put in over $100 billion in less than a year into this war in Ukraine. Where are our priorities? And I think that is part of the message that we have to take to the environmental movement, to all of the people of this country that want to see our focus being put on stopping the destruction of our planet, either through nuclear war or through the environmental crisis. That we are part of a global call to call on the leaders, both Putin and Zelensky and the US and NATO, to sit down at the negotiating table. The holiday season is coming up. We have the experience ceasefires that have been declared at holidays. Let's call for that now and make our call be a resounding one, heard in the White House here, to say, ceasefire, negotiate, don't escalate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Medea. I thought that had a lot of meat to it and was very well presented. We really appreciate it. And I agree with you wholeheartedly that we need to find a way to get this war over with so we can, first and foremost, save lives, and create a position of peace, but also so we can prevent the danger of escalation to nuclear war. And by the way, one expert that I have met in person, who's at the Harvard Kennedy School, estimates that there was a 20% chance of the Ukraine war escalating to the use of nuclear weapons. So these things are horrifyingly real. I'm anxious to hear from more of you in the question box, and I do have one kind of interesting questions in there already, which I'll start with, but I hope some of you may submit a few more because we can go up to 10 more minutes on this. And this question reads, are there any examples of negotiations that could be completed without rewarding an aggressor who has violated the very essence of the principles of non-aggression?
Well, yes. And I think in this case, it would not be rewarding the Russians because the talk is that it would go back to the position before the war began in terms of territory, and that Russia would have to pay compensation. There is a lot of money that has been frozen that belongs to Russia that is in the banks of other countries, and that money, it seems, could be made available as part of the compensation package for Russia, for Ukraine. And I think that the preconditions that Ukraine has put on talking to Russia are out of the question because it includes getting back Crimea. And I think there we have to understand that the majority of people in Crimea are Russian speaking, identify with Russia. While we might not think that referendum there was free and fair because it's under occupation, I think there could be an international referendum there. But I think the outlines of what a negotiation would look like would not at all be rewarding Russia. In fact, Putin would have to spin it very hard for it not to be a defeat. But I think if we're looking at the situation now, Putin has pretty much been defeated already in this war.
Thank you, Medea. Here's another question from one of our colleagues in the state of Maine, in fact. And she's asking about the recent news about a 3-star general and 300 US service members who are responsible for coordinating security assistance for Ukraine. Is this a new development, a new direction?
Well, it's another level of US involvement. And at one point, Zelensky, while he asked for a fast track to NATO, he said, you know, we are basically de facto already a member of NATO. And that's because of the deep, deep, deep involvement that the NATO countries, and especially the United States, have. And it includes these new 300 people. But, you know, we have also seen how the US intelligence has been responsible for a lot of the targeting that Ukraine has done, including the killing of many Russian generals. So while this issue of will NATO ever allow Ukraine to become a member, it has in fact given Ukraine pretty much all of the benefits of being a NATO member, including this amazing level of US and 40 other countries involved in the war.
Thank you, Medea. It's very good and insightful answer. I see I'm going to just pair a few questions here so we can get the rest of them in our remaining Q&A time. One is the USA certainly has something that Russia wants. What does Ukraine have except for territory? And then another one is that negotiation should be between Biden and Putin. Do you think there is a possibility they can be encouraged to meet and resolve this deep-rooted conflict that holds the whole world hostage? And let me just add a quick comment before turning it back to you, Medea, for responding to those, which is that I was encouraged actually that the top military officer in the United States of America, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, has said that, and again, he's not, the rest of the administration, and ironically, it's those in the State Department mostly, are resisting that. And certainly there ought to be a way of getting negotiations going, especially on the nuclear issue, that don't even necessarily need to directly have Ukraine involved. Certainly Ukraine must be involved when it comes to the terms of a settlement. But in terms of reducing the danger of the use of nuclear weapons, that's something that the whole world has a stake in. And I don't think you need to worry about whether the formulation of the negotiations is so tight. But Medea, what do you say to those two questions that were posted in our question box?
Well, starting on the second one, you know, there are issues between the US and Russia that have to be dealt with separately from negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. There's the issue of the US/NATO bases surrounding Russia. There's the issue of the West can lift those sanctions. And there's the issue of the arms treaties. And one of the positive things that I was kind of floored when I read about it is that they are going to start to be talks towards the end of this month between Russia and the US on the new treaty. And that is quite remarkable when you see that the relations between the US and Russia are at the lowest they've been since the Cold War. What does the US want from Ukraine? I think there is important to look at this issue of changing the goalposts from the US saying we want to support Ukraine's resistance to an illegal invasion to saying we want to weaken Russia. And let's face it, you know, we are living in a country where we're spending almost $1 trillion a year on the Pentagon. Most of that money going to the weapons industry here in the United States. There is an amendment that is being attached to the new NDAA, the National Defense. It will mean that the weapons companies will be able to get multi-year contracts that don't have to be approved year after year, and no bid contracts. And when this was first announced, their stocks went soaring. So let's remember, they are profiting tremendously from this war, and they have tremendous influence in the United States. The Secretary of Defense came directly from the board of Raytheon. So there's a lot of
Jen, it says you're the host. It just hit.
Am I for?
Okay, sorry, I apologize. Unfortunately, our bandwidth here at the office is not very good, but we should